Hello, my name's Robin Vincent and welcome to Surface Sessions. Today we're looking at the Surface Go, the lovely little fruity Surface. And we're going to have a look at how good the onboard audio is with music production software. Now, with something as small and cute as the Surface Go, then it seems likely that people are going to want to take it off in their bag on the bus to make music with it. And so using the onboard sound makes a lot of sense because you're not having to carry an extra box with you as you would with a USB audio interface. Now, I should stress at this point that you're going to get much better performance and a much happier time using a USB audio interface. But, you know, I can't stop you from doing what it is you want to do. You want to be out there on that mountain making and mixing music with just the Surface Go and nothing else, with just a finger. And that's fine. You can do that. And so the purpose of this video is to show you how best to do that, because it's just not that simple. Now, I know your Mac friends, right? They take their MacBook or their iPad and they disappear off somewhere and just make music. That's great. This is Windows, man. It's just not quite the same. Somehow, over the years, Microsoft have completely stuffed up the audio system on Windows. It's because, I mean, there's real reasons for it. It's because they have to get the audio system to work on such a vast range of computers and specifications. And so it just has all this stuff built into it to make sure that it's a nice, flowing and seamless experience regardless of what computer you're using. Apple don't have to do that. They've got like one computer and that's all they have to get to work. Not the same with Windows. But Windows does absolutely have the potential of being an awesome operating system for music. You've just got to give it a bit of a poke. You've got to fiddle around with it a little bit just to coax it down the right road. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, you should, before we go any further with your Surface Go, you should check out my video on how to tweak it to get it working properly for music, because none of these computers are built for music production, and similarly they have things built into them to make your internet browsing and your letter writing and your content creation and content absorption, to make all that work properly. But for generating proper music and music production and making tunes and stuff, the system needs a little bit of tweaking in order to make sure that the processor is giving you its full attention. So I have a video on that. Go and check that out. I also did a similar video to the one I'm doing now on the Surface Pro 6. And in that, I put in a lot of detail about latency, about bits and bobs and all sorts of things going on. So you might also want to watch that. But this is going to focus on the Surface Go, and I'm not going to keep running on like I always do. I'm just going to get straight to the facts. Straight to the facts, that's what I'm going to do. So what are the facts? Well, the facts are that every computer system has latency. Latency is this buzzword, this horrible word that makes you think, oh my goodness, nothing could ever possibly work. But latency, purely all it is the delay between triggering an action and hearing the sound. It's there in every single system because nothing can happen instantaneously. There's always the tiniest delay between hitting something and hearing the sound. And we're experiencing a bit of latency right now, which you might not be able to gather in the video, but there's a delay between that and actually the sound being generated, because it takes time for the computer to generate that sound. You go, the computer goes, oh look, he's hit a key, right, what we've got to do, we've got to put some sound together, let's put some sound together, boys, come on, let's put it together, and then throw that out. And the time it takes to do that, the delay between there and the sound is latency. That's what it is. Now, generally speaking, it's accepted that if you can get that delay down to just a handful of milliseconds, then we don't really notice it, because sound does travel in air at a certain speed, and actually milliseconds are what's involved in us standing this far away from a speaker. And so we're familiar with latency and we cope with it. But with a computer system, we need to take steps to minimize that to such a degree that it's hardly noticeable. And we can then play without having to worry too much. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm not going to worry about the onboard speakers. Sure, you can use the onboard speakers, but really, why would you? We're talking about the headphone socket, the output here. It's here, right next to the power and the USB-C output port thingy. It's on the other side to any of the other Surfaces. They all had it on this side here, but this is here. And that's what's plugged in, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today. Now, Windows has a really good audio engine built into it. It's called Wasapi and stands for things that nobody really cares about anymore. But the important thing is that it provides a low latency solution for your onboard audio. Mostly. Now I say mostly because a lot of things just don't support it. I mean, Microsoft keep telling me that, oh, Wasapi is great, man. Yeah, really low latency. It's fantastic. You've got to, just developers just need to write for it. It's going to be fantastic. It'll be just like Core Audio on the Mac and it'll be easy. And no, it's not. It's not. First of all, it's called Wasapi, which is of no help to anybody. And then there's lots of different modes and different versions and different bits. And there's no correlation between what's the low latency version or the high latency version. Is that working? It's just a mess on Windows, unfortunately. But let's look at Wasapi first. First problem you're going to have is that most of the software does not support it. There is some software that supports it. Reaper is worth looking at, and I'll be looking at that in a bit. But software like Ableton Live does not support it. Cubase does not support it. Pro Tools does not support it. So already most of the most popular DAWs are not going to have anything to do with Wasapi. They use old-fashioned driver architectures for running with onboard sound. Things like MME and DirectX. And they're all right, they can work, but you get this sort of latency. And let me see if I can demonstrate this to you in Ableton Live, which is what I've got running here, along with the excellent Retro mod from Traction Corporation. Now, the latency is such that it makes it difficult to play. It's not the end of the world, but it's difficult. Let me see if I can demonstrate that with perhaps a drum kit. Okay, here's a drum kit within Ableton Live. Let me see if I can pull off some kind of beat. No, I can't. I'm actually really good at that. I'm really good at banging out beats on the keyboard, and that was not it because there's too much lag. Right, so let's go into the settings within Ableton Live and see whether we can minimize that. So the driver type that Ableton Live understands in terms of regular onboard sound is called MME/DirectX. It's the old driver module. It's not Wasapi. And so this is commonly going to give us tens of milliseconds of delay. And the sort of level you want to get under is really 10 milliseconds. That's when things start to feel real time. Anything above that is going to sound a bit clangy. It's going to sound a bit crap. Now, within the settings within Ableton Live, you can reduce the buffer size. The buffer size is the space of memory in which the processor thinks about the audio before it sends it out. And it is that has a direct effect on the latency, because it's that amount of time. It's time-based. So that's the latency, the buffer size. So sometimes we talk about this in terms of milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds. Sometimes we talk about it in terms of samples, the size of the buffer. So 1024 samples, 512 samples, 128 samples. And those two things are absolutely related. It's just two different ways of talking about more or less the same thing. So at the moment, with the current driver, it's set to just about 4,000 samples, which it says is an output latency of nearly 100 milliseconds. 100 milliseconds is awful. That's never going to feel like real time. So what I can do is reduce the buffer size in order to make the latency smaller. Well, that sounds like a good idea, so let's do that. So here is the sample amount here. You can see it's set to headphones. So I'm just going to reduce that down and see whether that helps. See, the interesting thing is that it's actually got worse. If I reduce it down to levels that are supposed to be really good, like 5 milliseconds, that should be real time. Well, that doesn't seem to make any sense at all. So let's take it back up. Ooh. To around there. Okay, that's better. but it's still too laggy. It's too laggy to play. So what the heck is going on there then? Well, as you will find, if you spend your time in this world long enough, like I have, messing around with computers, latency, audio interfaces, buffer sizes, and the promises of Wasapi, the promises of Microsoft and what could be possible, is that none of it is particularly consistent. None of it really does what it says it's supposed to do, because there's always other things involved. So what's going on is that the driver that Ableton Live is able to use is just not very good. And because there's something else in play, and that's the load on the processor. Because it's all very well having a nice big buffer, gives the processor lots of room to process the audio, which gives us a long delay, but we get perfect playback. As you reduce that buffer, the processor has to work extra hard, harder and harder in order to achieve glitch-free playback. So as we reduced the size of the buffer, the processor actually went, oh my goodness, I can't cope with all of this. And so it ended up glitching and sounding crackly and actually taking longer because the buffer is just overflowing and it's just not working. So the problem with using the old driver architecture in Ableton Live is simply that you're not going to get low latency because the processor can't handle having to process the audio in this really low quality, crappy buffer provided by these drivers. It just can't cope with it. If you were to plug in a USB audio interface that comes with proper, decent ASIO drivers, then the processor would have no problem. It would go, all right, now this is easy. Look, I've got a nice space here in order to do something. I mean, the space might be small in order to get the latency down, but everything works properly. So the audio goes in and out really quick, really nice, really glitch-free, without too much load on the processor. So if you want to use Ableton Live with the Surface Go, what are your options other than a USB audio interface? Well, there is another option, and the whole point of showing you this is just to demonstrate that the Windows drivers, the drivers that come with Windows for something like Ableton Live, are not up to the task of doing real-time audio processing. Now, if you're just fiddling around with loops and a little bit of mixing, then you don't necessarily need the latency to be really low, and so you can get away with it. But for most of us, we want to play something, don't we? We want to be able to play a beat. We want to be able to play a tune, some sounds. We want to be able to do that and for it to actually sound sort of real as opposed to really terrible. So how do we do that? Well, with some applications, you can use the newer Wasapi drivers from Microsoft. You could use them in Reaper, you can use them in Bitwig, Stage-like, that sort of thing, but not in the main doors like Ableton, Pro Tools and Cubase. For that, we need another solution, and that's what I'm going to show you how to use. It's called ASIO for All. Now, ASIO for All is a third-party driver wrapper. It's not made by Microsoft, it's made by some other bloke, I think, and it's an awesome piece of software that's been around for a long time and is just the best way of getting your onboard sound to work properly with audio applications. What it does, it takes your crappy drivers, it wraps them up in something called ASIO for All. ASIO stands for Audio System In-Out and was created by Steinberg, who make the Cubase DAW, and has become the standard of Windows drivers audio interface architecture or something. It's the name of the drivers that you use with audio interfaces to make it work properly. And so ASIO for All gives you an ASIO driver. All it's doing really is realizing the potential of those drivers properly and giving the processor the best chance of getting audio in and out of your system without any glitches and with a latency low enough to make it playable. So to demonstrate that, I will stick it onto Ableton here, hopefully in order to demonstrate the difference. So now with the ASIO for All driver loaded, the sound's still going to come out of the same place, still going to come out of the headphone socket, but the latency is now playable. Well, yeah, more or less. But it's greatly improved over it was using the regular DirectX MME type drivers. And that's why ASIO for All is great. But it's also a little bit tricky because the settings in ASIO for All are a bit weird, a bit deep, and most of them don't really work very well. So I'm going to bring the camera in and show you exactly how you set up ASIO for All so that you can get access to this low latency mode. So when you first load up ASIO for All, it appears here in the drop down menu. ASIO for All version 2, that's what you want. It'll probably come up with a buffer size of either 256 or 512 samples, which, you know, is not great, but it'll do. But the playing will feel a little sluggish. So you'll be thinking, oh wow, that guy said that ASIO for All is the magic answer, and yet I'm still getting this kind of latency. That's a bit crap. Well, yes, indeed it is. And in order to resolve that, we need to look at the configuration of ASIO for All. So hit hardware setup here. If you're using a different DAW and it doesn't have some way of accessing the hardware, then you'll probably find it down here by the clock as this little green sort of play button thing. That's the controls for ASIO for All. It only comes up when you have loaded it as a driver within some audio software. Otherwise, you're never going to find it. So when you first bring it up, you'll be looking something like this. There's not a whole lot of action going on, nothing you can do until you press the spanner. Press the spanner. That gives us a more advanced view. Then, don't worry about any other entries. I mean, this audio fuse one here is for my USB audio interface, which is also connected that I'm not currently using. So we're interested in the Realtek high definition at the top. Now you'll find there's a little tiny weeny plus button next to it. Press on that to open it up. And within here is a whole load of stuff that we don't really need to worry about. It's just revealing all the different driver modes that the onboard audio has, because Microsoft in their wisdom has created two different drivers, one for the speakers, one for the headphone socket. The reason for that is because your listening experience with speakers and listening experience with headphones is different, and so they wanted to create a unique listening experience. That's fine, we're not interested, but what we need to ensure is that it's the Realtek HD Audio second output that is active. That is the headphone socket. So if you're getting sound out of speakers, it's because you're using the other one down here. Now it doesn't matter that both of them are active, it usually defaults to this second one here. But if you're any doubt, then just deselect that one so it's no longer active. That's the speakers one, so you're not going to accidentally be coming out of the speakers. Now, what about this latency then? Well, we can reduce the buffer size down to the lowest possible setting, which is 64 samples. But it's made no difference whatsoever. That's because that the output selected here is the wrong one, because this driver offers up a stereo output at 44.1 or 48, or a 6-channel output at 8 to 192 kilohertz. Now this 6-channel output is for DVDs, it's for Blu-rays, it's for sound, it's for content and video watching and gaming. It's not for music production. And that has some inbuilt buffers to provide a glitch-free playback for when you're playing movies. That's not what we need. We need the other one. So select the other one. Done. Now we get this strange symbol. Now that strange symbol means that it doesn't know what the heck is going on and the whole thing's not going to work. And it's right, it doesn't work. The reason for that is because there's some kind of disconnect between the input through the inbuilt microphones and the output. They have to be the same sample rate. But for some reason, I saw this exactly the same with the Surface Pro 6, is that there's something going on with ASIO for All on Windows where it's not able to correlate the sample rate between the input and the output. And so it just spanners out and goes, oh, I have no idea what's going on. I've tried all sorts of different ways to resolve this by setting sample rates and forcing sample rates, and it all just results in crackles and nastiness. The only best solution I found is to disable the input. Ooh, there we go. Now you think to yourself, I've disabled the input, I can't do any recording. Well, that's true. But since the only recording you can do with the onboard sound is with the built-in microphone, then that's not really any loss. If you want to do recording, use a proper USB audio interface and a proper microphone. So this is, I'm afraid, the best solution I can find for providing low latency playback for your synths. And now look, it's now good. So that there, just to recap, is what you need to set in ASIO for all. You need to turn on the spanner, you need to turn on the second output, and you need to put it to the 2 times 44.1 to 48 kilohertz option and turn off the input. That will make it all work for you. So yeah, there you go. That's more or less it. ASIO for all running on the Surface Go will give you, arguably, the best low latency playback, the response that you need to be able to play tunes and percussion and stuff in real time. Now, just to finish this video off, I'm going to open up Reaper, which supports both Wasapi and ASIO, and just test to see what the difference in latency would be. Now, I've been using a test where I used the output from my Base Station 2 here, the physical output of a synthesizer from this, compared to what's being generated by the computer. And that's been quite revealing, I have to say, in showing the difference between when the sound here hits my recording over there and the sound from the computer hits the recording. You can measure that difference as the latency between the two systems. I mean, it's not completely perfect because there's always going to be latency involved in how fast I hit it, and milliseconds involved in triggering of this and triggering of that, but it gives us a good idea and should hopefully demonstrate how good Wasapi is in the right situation and how good ASIO for all is in the right situation. And I'll also compare it with my audio fuse here, which is a USB audio interface, which does things at super low latency. And maybe also that'll demonstrate why you really do need to have a USB audio interface. So here we are in Reaper. I've got a copy of Massive loaded, which is a nice synthesizer, and I'll be able to compare the two sounds. So to do that, I need to take that out of there, take this there, I need to plug this in. So I'm essentially taking one side of my output here, oh, there we go, to my other computer, which is going to do the recording, and I'll take the physical output from the here, so I've then got, that's Massive, and then that's the Base Station. Can you hear how they're nicely phasing? So I'm going to set up different audio drivers within Reaper, hit this a few times, record it over there, and then measure the time difference between their arrival into the recording software. Does that make sense? I'll bring you in so you can see it a little bit closer. So at the moment I've got it set to ASIO for all. It's set to 256 samples. I'm going to take that down to the minimum it can do. Now, although we change these settings here, it doesn't always necessarily translate to a difference in what we hear, which is always interesting. So now, as it says down here, it's down to 64 samples, and it should be about 5.4 milliseconds, is what it says. We shall see. We now change it to Wasapi. Now there's two modes with Wasapi. There's shared mode and exclusive mode, which brilliantly adds to the complexity of this nonsense. Exclusive mode means the driver's only being used for this piece of software, whereas in shared mode it can be used by the rest of Windows at the same time. Shared mode tends to be slightly slower, so we're going to see whether exclusive mode works. And currently it has a sample block size of 128. So let's see if that works. Okay, it says up here 128 samples, giving us an output latency of 4.5. Let's try taking the block size down to 64 samples. Let's try shared mode as a comparison. So a much higher latency, it says, of 22 milliseconds. You can really feel that. And then lastly, as a comparison, we'll go back to ASIO, but we'll use the audio fuse, my USB audio interface. And we'll take that down to as far as we can possibly take it. So looking at the recordings in Vegas, I'm able to show the difference between the left channel and the right channel, because that's how I had the left channel was from the computer, from the Surface Go, and the right channel was from the base station. So the base station one hits first, followed by the computer generated one afterwards, and the gap between the two is the latency. How exciting to measure latency in this way. So here we have ASIO for All I started with, and this is the difference. And that's about 54 milliseconds. 54 milliseconds. See, that's unexpected. I saw very similar results with the Surface Pro 6. And when you actually come to measure latency in some kind of way, even, I mean, this is not scientifically precise, but it's close enough, that actually there's a lot more latency involved than you would think. Because at this 50 milliseconds, I was playing the percussion quite happily, and and it was working. It was not bothersome, and we would normally expect that to be under 10 milliseconds. So I'm not drawing any conclusions from that other than to say, that's interesting. So next we wound down the buffer size to 64 samples. Let's see if that made any difference. Yes, it did. That's taken it down to 45 milliseconds. Next we went to exclusive mode on the Wasapi drivers. Now exclusive mode on Wasapi is supposed to be Microsoft's best low latency driver, and that's the one that they would like developers to be developing for and writing for, and the result is brilliant. It's 9 milliseconds. It's not the 2 milliseconds that it reported it would be, but it's 9 milliseconds, which is great. And then we went back to shared mode Wasapi, which is the kind of more standard Wasapi driver, and that was reporting about 20 milliseconds. Well, here we can see that it's 66 milliseconds, and you could certainly feel that. You could feel the difference between the two, more so than you could with the 40 milliseconds of ASIO for All. And then finally we used the Arturia drivers, reducing that down to as fast as we could make it, and as you can see here, that gave us 3 milliseconds. Now that's really doing it. So what does it all mean? Ultimately, well, it means that our ideas of latency and the way we measure these things are often flawed and filled with trouble. But what I'm trying to get across in this video is that you can absolutely use the onboard sound of the Surface Go and use it successfully. For a lot of software that you start up that doesn't support Wasapi, you are going to run into large latency problems. And to get around that, you use this very handy utility called ASIO for All, and that'll reduce the latency down to playable levels. However, if your software does support Wasapi, particularly Wasapi exclusive mode, why does it have to be so complicated? I don't know, but if it does, then you are going to be able to get down even lower than ASIO for All. And actually, that's the first time I've really seen that happen. It's the first time I've seen that work. So Windows 10, Microsoft, their driver architecture has really started to become a fabulous thing. The downside being that very few bits of software actually support it. Reaper does, StageLight does, Bitwig does. Those are ones to look out for if you want it just to work out of the box. Otherwise, for the rest of us, ASIO for All is still the best solution, and that's decades old, that piece of software, but it's still doing it in most circumstances. What I haven't covered in this video is whether those different driver protocols provide a different level of actual CPU performance. Is it harder for the processor to run Wasapi than it is to run ASIO for All? See, that's interesting, but that's going to be for another video. So moving forward from here, I'm going to start doing some proper performance testing of this fella, of the Surface Pro 6, and compare it against an earlier generation of Surface as well. So look out for those videos coming very soon. But hopefully now you'll be able to run with your Surface Go in the full knowledge that it can work without any audio interface attached, and you can just start making music with it. That's the plan. So there you go. I hope this video was useful to you. Please do all the usual things like subscribe and stuff. You should like to see me produce more videos quicker than I do, because it's taken a long time and it's hard work sometimes. Then please consider becoming a patron and throw me a few dollars in order to help me fund the making of more videos and being able to focus more of my time on this rather than the day job that I have to do. So thanks a lot, and in the meantime, go make some tunes.